Hi, so recently Unreal Engine 5.5 preview was released, and while I was going over the changes, I thought it would be nice to actually cover all of the interesting things I found in the new version in a video, specifically related to game development. So I would be ignoring everything for virtual production or graphic design and stuff like that. While there was a lot of updates there, I don't really care about that as a game developer. So in this video, we're just going to cover a bunch of stuff related specifically to game development. Let's start with character movers, and in this 5.5 update they focused a lot on animation support, which for me personally I did not care that much about, just because I really want to see a good blueprint support for mover, so that way I can start working on it, and I think it's going to be way more accessible instead of having to do some stuff in C++. But if you want to start working with mover, you can go to plugins, type in mover, and enable mover here. You can also do examples and mover tests. So I open up one of the maps in here. You can go to your engine plugins and then more examples and maps, and you can have a bunch of maps that developers added to test a bunch of stuff. So if we look in here, you can see they have stuff for testing slopes, for launching the character, for AI. You have dashing, zip lines, you have stairs, which right now do not work the best, I don't think, but they're working on it. So this is unlockable steps, and then you have this. So at any point you can basically play in here and check it out, see how it works. And of course the characters that they're using, you can also check out and use their C++ now, but I think they're working on the support for blueprints also. Next big thing that Epic announced were Megalites, and this is their system for managing a lot of lights in your scene. So before you would get some issues if you had bunch of dynamic lights really close together, or just bunch of the lights in general in your scene, you can see some drastic frame drop, stuff like that. So they're working on Megalites, which I'm not sure how it works in the background. I'm guessing some volumetric thing where you actually do not care about a single instance of the light, but they're batched together or something, I'm not sure. But they're working on this. So I have a level in here to showcase it. Let me zoom out. I'm going to go to the edge of the cave here. So this is basically how it looks right now. We have our frame rate counter, so it's around 35 FPS. And it looks decent. Okay, so let's enable Megalites. And there is not much difference. There is a little bit of a difference with shadows, but we get some FPS, probably like 20 to 30% FPS back, so that's not bad. And stuff generally looks fine. Pretty nice. One thing that I noticed in this specific map is that if you notice in here how some lights disappear, for example in here, when I zoom out, so it's not perfect, there is some bleeding light that is not showing there, but in general I think it works fine. I'm not sure if it's production ready, probably some little quirks to figure out, but in general it's actually pretty nice. And if it can handle multiple lights, I'm guessing they're trying to do something similar like what Nanite does for geometry. But yeah, not much different, but there is some stuff happening at a distance. For example, in here, if I start zooming in, you can see kind of how the light changes a little bit. So I'm not sure exactly what's happening there, but there is some stuff maybe getting lost, I'm guessing. You can see if I disable Megalites, we do not have the shadows changing in here. So there's probably some compromise that happens, but in general, it should help developers get higher FPS in really highly intensive scenes with a lot of dynamic lights. Next, we have batch rename. What you can do now is, let's say I select maybe these two or these three blueprints. I can right click and then we can batch rename all of the selected assets. So this seems like a nice convenient thing that they added. For example, maybe you want pp/ and then it shows in here how it's going to look after the change. And you can do multiple things in here, but then you press apply and you just change the name for a bunch of assets. So just nice small thing. The rigging editor got an update. So if you open up our skeletal mesh, we have this edit skeleton button, and we can basically edit the skeleton of the character. We can add new bones, we can weight paint, do a bunch of stuff here, and now it is considered production ready. To test it out, what I did is just put their normal skeletal mesh into the level, convert it to static mesh, and then you can convert the static mesh into skeletal mesh. And after that I had a character with just one root bone, and I started adding my own bones just to see how it feels. And after playing a little bit with it, it seems nice, but I'm not sure how good it is for complex meshes. You might have to go to some other DCC software to do that, but for simple stuff like editing weights, adding additional bones, it seems fine enough. So you would go to add, for example, you can select a bone, and then from that bone you can add a new bone. It's going to try to figure out where you want it inside of the character, which is also convenient. I think generally did a pretty decent job. I think I had to play around a little bit For the knees, I did not move them at all, so I would probably move them a little bit more forward, but in general, it did a decent job. So I'm gonna cancel here. Then you have skinning, you can edit weights, basically select which bone you want by right-clicking, and then you can just paint around and add weights. So pretty nice. For simple games, this is probably good to use and not even leave Unreal Engine, but for more complex, you might need to go to Blender or Maya or some other software. Next thing I really wanted to try, but it did not work for me for some reason. Skeletal Mesh now has nanite support, and I think it's in experimental mode, so for me, it crashes when I try to do it. If you type nanite and try to enable nanite and then apply, for me, it will crash. And I tried it on multiple characters, so I'm not exactly sure what's happening, if it's a preview thing or it's just something on my side. But you should also have now nanite skeletal meshes. If you open up plugins menu now, you're also going to get these plugin directories. And in here, you can select different folders from which you want to pull plugins from, so you can have your general plugins folder instead of having to copy paste plugins directly into your project. So this is a convenience thing, changing a little bit your workflow to make it more convenient. So pretty nice. I'm probably going to be testing and maybe using in the future, because I do have some of my custom plugins that I transfer from project to project, some small utility things that help me work. So it would be nice to test this. Next, we have local exposure. Local exposure is a technique that applies local adjustments that preserve both highlight and shadow details on top of the global exposure. And I tried to test this out. It might be hard to see if you're looking in a video, but there is decent amount of difference from 5.4 to 5.5. So first, I try to keep the settings all the same from 5.4 and 5.5. And in here, it is a bit more noisy. There is this little shadow at the bottom, and the green is a little bit tilted, even though I have the exact hex values from the 5, and also the general shadows are a bit more blotchy. I also noticed that when you move, I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but it is very jumpy and very noisy how it moves. But if you go to 5.5, you can see how it's way more stable. There is no shadow from the box here, a bit less blotchiness on the walls, and when it moves way more smoothly. In general, it seems like there is a lot of improvements with this local exposure and emissive material, stuff like that. Substrate is now in beta, so they haven't tested it in Fortnite or any larger projects, but they say that it has all of the features that the legacy materials have. So that's nice. Now, Substrate seems like it is way more customizable and has some new features like layering materials. And I haven't played much with it, but I have it in here just to see how you do something. So I'm guessing you use something like this, their Substrate material node, and then you have a bunch of these options that you can customize. Compared to a normal material that had only something like this, you would have base color, metallic, specular roughness, normal, and that's kind of very tense. I think Substrate can also be layered, so you can have one layer of one material and then another layer of another material. And to enable it, you would go to project settings and type Substrate. In here, Substrate materials, and you're going to have to wait a little bit for a bunch of shaders to compile, and then you can basically test it out and see how it works. Keep in mind, when you enable it, you cannot use normal materials anymore. Now your final node is going to look like this, and then you have to work within the structure of Substrate. Next, we have this Mutable Customizable Characters plugin, which seemed interesting, but I haven't had the time to check it out. If I understood correctly, how this works is you can have a character that can be customizable, and you can set it up with these plugin assets. For example, in here, I just tried creating a few of these assets. And if you open it up, we have this blueprint graph, and in here we would probably set up all of the different variations for the character that we have. You have the preview here and a bunch of options that you can customize your character. And then you can also deal with populations. If you have different variations of the characters, you can add weights and stuff like that, so you can generate a bunch of different variations for the character. To enable this plugin, you can go into your plugins and type Mutable, and you can basically enable it in here. I wanted to give a quick mention to physics control component, which lets you add physics to the character in more modular way, where you can attach a component, and then the component can deal in many different ways with the mesh. You can select parts of the character that you want to be physics controlled. There is weights. I briefly played around with it a few months ago, but honestly I don't know much about it, so it will be interesting to try out and see how it actually works. But yeah, pretty interesting, probably useful for specific types of games. In general, you probably won't use it but if you have any physics-based games, this might be really useful and save you a bunch of time. So next thing we have is first-person rendering. This helps the objects not clip into the world objects, so they scale independently of the FOV, I'm guessing. So I haven't tested it much, but basically you have your first-person field of view. This is your general third-person field of view, and then you have first-person scale, which I'm not sure exactly how it works. So you can scale it to 1, which gives this black box for some reason, not sure why, but you can basically scale the first-person field of view. And only the objects that have this first-person boolean enabled will have this effect. So if I disable it, you can see how it's not scaling anymore. So I would have to play around more with it, see how it works, but this feature is in 5.5 now. Local fog volumes have been added, which are these really cheap fog actors that you can just add in your level. So you would go in here, and then type local fog volume, and you can just put it in a scene. It is effectively a sphere, so it's meant, I think, mainly for landscapes in the distance. So for example, if you look below, you can see how we can see fog below, so it's going to go through objects. It's mainly just when you're at a distance, you can have this fog showing far away, maybe in the forest or somewhere in the mountains. And then when you come closer, it's gonna basically fade away. You have few options in here. You have fog density and fog height. You also have color, but in general, it's pretty simple, pretty nice local fog that you can add anywhere. Next one, we will need a little bit more explanation. So it's external data layers. And basically a data layer is a group of objects that you can enable or disable. And they added support for game feature plugin to use this, basically meaning when you enable a game feature, you can also at the same time enable a data layer. And this way you can dynamically show or hide different parts of your game depending on which game feature is enabled. How it works is first you need to have game features enabled. So this plugin is going to let you add a game feature plugin. And this plugin can dynamically be enabled or disabled in your project. For example, for me, if you go to plugins, this is my custom plugin that I named Data Layers Test. And in here, if you right click and then you create a data set and find game feature data and just name it as the name of the project. I think before you had to do it for it to be enabled, but maybe it finds it automatically even if it's not the same name, I'm not sure. But when you open it, you're going to have these 4 states that your game feature can be in. And if it's registered or loaded, it's not actually active or the player cannot see it. But when it's active, it's actually influencing gameplay. If it's loaded, it's just in the memory. If it's registered, it's just in the list that it can be loaded into memory, basically. And install it, it's not even registered. It just exists in the project. In here, what you can do is add world partition content and you can create a new external data layer. And I already did all of this. So if you go to data layer, we see that this external data layer. And I added a few things in the data layer. And if you select some objects, usually in the data layer, you can right click and then add the selected actors into it. But for some reason, for external data layer, that does not work. So you have to right click in here and then external data layer, and then you can add it to the data layer. And now it's enabled. And if I go to loaded, you can see how my objects disappeared and there is no external data layer here. So this game feature explicitly needs to be enabled for this data layer to be loaded. It's actually a pretty nice feature. I might start using game features again just to see how it feels. I used it maybe a year ago the last time and they were fine. They were missing a few things that I would have liked to have. And this is one of the nice things. So I might check back on it again, but yeah, pretty interesting. Now I haven't gone into PCG a lot, so I won't be covering all of these features, even though I think they might be useful for some people, especially if you're working with procedural content generation before. There seems to be a huge amount of updates for it. You have GPU compute support now. There is grammar, so I'm guessing you basically create rules. Before you would have to do this from scratch. I'm guessing now they have a system to make it way easier for you to work with this. Basically create the rules how the things can work together with each other, and then when one thing is added, the other things adjust or stuff like that. Pretty nice. Next thing is this PCG graph executor, so basically performance boost for multi-threading. You also have the geometry processing, so I think you can work with polygons or something like that. I haven't looked too much into it, but I think you can now work with vertices, polygons, edges. You have support for data layers. You can actually raycast in the world, which is pretty crazy. You got A-star pathfinding now, bunch of stuff. So I think this might be the biggest thing that came from the version 5.5, but I didn't even see that much of it in their presentation. So pretty nice. At some point I should go and learn a bit more about procedural content generation in Unreal, but since the system is so huge, I just didn't have time for it. They seem to also work a lot on the editor preview, especially for mobile. So this is nice. They had some presentations related to this. Now, I haven't worked much with mobile, but I briefly tested out if I change the preview platform to Android Vulkan, so you can basically check out the graphics, and you can also play mobile and do some other stuff. Especially now that Fortnite is back on iOS, they're probably gonna bring more focus and support on mobile for Unreal. While we are talking about mobile, they also added few more features to mobile renderer. Now it supports decals, rectangular lights, capsule shadows, point light shadows, bunch of new stuff. Also PSO pre-catching, which is nice, and screen space reflections. Next thing that got a bunch of small updates is modeling tools. We don't need to go into it. Just if you haven't worked with it much, you can go to selection mode here, modeling, and then you have a bunch of modeling stuff that you can check out. It's getting better and better. It still, at least feels to me, a little bit rough to work with, but it was way better than initial version, which was almost impossible to work with. Now it's a bit more convenient, but still similar to their rigging editor. It's probably good for medium to simple changes, but for more complex stuff, you're gonna also have to go to some DCC application. For modeling, we also have UV tools. In here, you have a bunch more options to more conveniently edit UVs. And we also have texturing tools. This is for their procedural texture editor. So I tried it in here, and you can enable it if you go to plugins and then texture graph. It's still pretty experimental, but basically what you can do is right click, go to texture, create a texture graph, and then you're gonna get something like this. And in here, I just created the really simple textures where I took this little image here and image here, and I'm just warping the first image based on the second image. And we can get material like this. Of course, you can create stuff way more interesting and advanced, but they got some updates, some new nodes. And after you finish creating stuff, what you can do is right click here, export texture graph. So the other asset was just an editor, but you can export the actual texture. And just to show as an example, you can see it in here on the box, similar to how it looked in the editor. Geometry scripting is also one of the things I haven't gone much into, but it also got a bunch of small updates to how it works. Now you can do more stuff with bones, with texels, and other stuff that I'm just not too familiar with. So at some point I might go into it, but a bunch of new updates here. Next, the importer got some updates, especially around FBX file formats. So importing FBX is a little bit different. You also have an option to create a level instance from the assets you're importing. So a few updates to mention here. Next, we have state trees, and they're kind of a combination of behavior trees and state machines. And I did play around with them a little bit when they initially released, but they seem just too confusing and complicated to efficiently work with them. I avoided them for a year, but I might test them out again, see if they're more user-friendly now. But they have few updates here, so you can diff them now. There is some runtime stuff that you can change here and some UI stuff, which is badly needed. If you go into the engine, they look like this now, so pretty similar. But when you go to a state, you can see they have a bunch of different stuff in here that they color changed. I think they added this selection utility for weights. I'm guessing what probability it is to pick this node here. But yeah, bunch of stuff changed, especially visually. I'm still not exactly sure how user-friendly it is, especially because before when I was working with it, the parameters were a bit confusing because I was trying to, I think, change them in multiple nodes and then only one updated them or something like that. I remember having a bunch of issues, but maybe the issues were fixed and it's more obvious how you can use them. But yeah, they got a bunch of updates. Another quick mention is instance actor and mass entity. So as far as I can see, they're trying to merge mass entity system with their actors, especially with instancing actors. So that way you can have thousands or tens of thousands of actors in your level that are being simulated with mass entity, but then when you come closer to them, they can switch to more complex blueprint actor and get some deeper behavior. So quick thing that they are working there, which is pretty interesting. They're basically trying to automatically do this for you instead of you having to manually batch or manage instance actors or multiple actors. Next thing that I'm really happy to see, and it is long overdue, are auto-generated navlings. I think this came about because of the Fortnite Lego survival open world game. I think they needed a bit more complex navigation, so they finally decided to work a bit on their AI navigation system. Now you have auto-generated navlinks. To showcase this, I created a little small scene in here. If I press P, that is going to visualize my navigation. You can see these points that were created automatically, these lines for the characters to jump on the objects. So you can see how it automatically generates again, which is really nice. This is something that I actually waited for a project that I'm working on because they were mentioning that it's coming, so I really wanted to use this instead of having to manually manage navlinks. So how it works is if we find this recast nav mesh actor, you can scroll down and find this generate navlinks, and then you can enable it in here, and you have a bunch of options about how you want your navlink to work, depending on how much the characters can jump, distance, edges, how many of the links you want. You can have all of that in here. It seems pretty simple to edit and configure, so that's also pretty nice. I'm going to give a quick mention to the learning agents. It seems like they have native support for ML learning actors that you can modify for your game and set up to do simple machine learning actions. There are few updates for chaos, but I wanted particularly to focus on chaos modular vehicles and mention that. You have their system where you can dynamically change vehicles and put them together almost like Legos. This also I haven't touched, so I cannot comment too much about it. And I also tried to open their level and see if I can play with an example. Now, for some reason, the commands are not working for me, but I can press buttons and change vehicles, which gives some interesting results. But you can have modular vehicles, play with them and put them together. So they have also this example that you saw in the level, and the setup seems a little bit complicated. There is a bunch of stuff, but if they have a pre-made character, you can figure it out and use it for your own game. Next thing to mention is chaos destruction. So you have some editor improvements, some performance or memory improvements. It seems like it's going to be using less memory. There is also some data flow updates. I briefly touched data flow, seemed interesting, but I think it's in experimental mode, so there is not much use that you can get in production, so it's probably more for just testing. But yeah, chaos destruction got a few updates. Another thing to mention is Niagara lightweight emitters. This seems like they added a simple Niagara emitter that might not have all of the feature as a full-fledged Niagara system, but it is really lightweight. So I'll mention it in here. If you are creating stuff for mobile, maybe you need really light in terms of performance particles. You can probably look into this and see if you can use it. And the last thing I'm going to mention is reference viewer. So there is some user experience improvements here. You can see what is inheriting from what in the view. You also have a few more updates in here. And to check out the reference viewer, I'm going to right click on this material for the character. And here you can see it looks pretty similar as before, but what you can do is right click on our main asset that we are looking at, and you can do resolve referencing assets. And in here you get this information, which I'm not sure exactly how useful it is, but basically they're adding additional information for the reference viewer, which is nice. So yeah, that's all of the main things related to game development that you might be interested in when checking out 5.5. And there is, of course, a bunch more stuff, and for your specific game, you might want to check out some other stuff, but the two of these things were the most interesting, so I wanted to cover them. Check out the Unreal Engine public roadmap. In here, you can see the roadmap for a bunch of different versions. So you have forward-looking, which is for 5.6 and after versions, and you have 5.5 we just released, and specifically 5.5 preview was released, but the full 5.5 version is going to come at the end of the month, so I'm guessing it's going to also change some stuff in here, and they're also going to polish any bugs or issues they have right now with the preview version. So yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you find the video interesting, and see you in the next one.